Hey guys, new book, Flatt Stanley, his original adventure. If you've never read it before, or if you know that it's a series, this is fun. You could pick it up after you're finished. So I'm going to read the back to you first, because as good readers like to look at the front, check it out. Written by Jeff Brown. And the back says, Stanley Landtrap is an ordinary boy. At least he was, until the night his bulletin board fell off the wall and flattened him. All of a sudden, Stanley can slide under doors, mail himself across the country in an envelope, and fly like a kite. But flatness has its serious side too. Sneak thieves have been stealing paintings from the famous Museum of Art, and Stanley knows he's the only one who can stop them. Will the robbers discover Stanley's plan before he foils them? Da, 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 da. It's the kind of book I like to read. Mysteries. So, it's not a very long book. First chapter is called The Big Bulletin Board. Try to imagine Stanley's perspective. So here we are, 3D objects we can turn in our hands and all the rest. And then imagine suddenly becoming flat, completely flat. And put yourself in that mindset as you listen to the story. The bulletin board. Breakfast was ready. I will go wake the boys, Mrs. Landtrap said to her husband, George Landtrap. Just then, their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. Hey, come and look, hey! Mr. and Mrs. Landtrap were very much in favor of politeness and careful speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, Mr. Landtrap said as they entered the bedroom. Please try to remember that. Excuse me, Arthur said, but look. He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay the enormous bulletin board that Mr. Landtrap had given the boys a Christmas ago, so that they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley, but Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would still have been sleeping if he had not been woken up by his mother's shout. What's going on here? He called out cheerfully from beneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Landtrap hurried to lift it from the bed. Heavens, said Mrs. Landtrap. Gosh, said Arthur. Stanley is flat. As a pancake, said Mr. Landtrap. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Let's all have breakfast, Mrs. Landtrap said. Then Stanley and I will go see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say. Here's Dr. Dan in here. Now I'm listening to this and thinking, yeah, I don't know if I would react that way as a mom. I think it would have a few more questions, like, are you okay? Does everything feel all right? Your kid is flat. In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley all over. How do you feel? He asked. Does it hurt very much? Questions I would personally ask. I felt sort of tickly for a while after I got up, Stanley said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, Dr. Dan said. We'll just have to keep an eye on you. Sometimes we doctors, despite all of our years of training and experience, can only marvel at how little we really know. Mrs. Landtrap said she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered by a tailor now. So Dr. Dan told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements. Mrs. Landtrap wrote them all down. Stanley was 4 feet tall and about a foot wide and a half an inch thick. Half an inch thick. Chapter 2. Being flat. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the doors were closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Landtrap said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide himself under the door, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Landtrap one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Landtrap began to cry. I have an idea, Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of the back of his belt and the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will go look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down and from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she was still holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice. "What's the matter, lady? Is your yo-yo stuck?" they asked. "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you really must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We have caught a cuckoo." Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame." The policeman apologized. "We didn't get it, lady. We have been hasty. We see that now." "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realized that was a very good rule, and they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mrs. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive. I will have to think of some cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. Can you guess what might happen? "Now then, Stanley, try this for size," he said. The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a toothbrush filled with some milk. Toothbrush case filled with milk. They had put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both the airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into the envelope, along with the egg salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk, and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right out again. Can you guess what the word limber might mean? Limber boy who folded and unfolded. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine," he said. "Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear." Then she and Mr. Lambert cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and they went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it "valuable" and "fragile," and this end up on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family they had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the postal service, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. Chapter 3. Stanley the Kite. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons, to a museum or roller skating in the park. But it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and his brothers would often be jostled about from side to side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got Flatt. Mr. Landtrap discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel or a bag. He could hold on to Arthur with one hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Landtrap's. "Well, George, I see you have brought some wallpaper. Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper? Oh, no. This is my son, Stanley." He undid the string, and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller." The man said, "George," he said to Mr. Landtrap, "that boy is Flatt." "Smart, too," Mr. Landtrap said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Landtrap said. "And he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Landtrap rolled Stanley back up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard when they were on their way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Landtrap heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. So that's something that you don't have anymore, but there are like a lot of different dictionaries, and it's A through Z, and you can look in those information to learn about things. It's kind of like Googling it, but in books. I wonder what the boy is doing. What do you think? Piling all those books together on himself. I'm guessing he's feeling a little sad or angry. I can infer that because of his actions and the way he looks in this picture. I think he's feeling a little left out. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Landtrap sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made of beautiful colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everybody else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Arthur remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose string was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me," Arthur said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran across the grass sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley. Being a kite, he knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and he let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He only had to turn his thin body edge to the wind carefully, a little at a time, so it did not get hold of him. And then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park just stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long mashed swoops. He held his arms by his side and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again like the sun, toward the sun. His hands slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and stars. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Landtrap flew that day. Probably no one would ever fly that way again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with an empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until the leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still very cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mr. Lambchop sighed and shook his head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with these boys. It's very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." Next chapter is chapter 4, which we will read next time.